Sometimes the smallest creatures carry the biggest hearts, and sometimes a single moment of kindness can change the course of history. In 1847, 12-year-old Apache girl Ahuli finds the tiniest wolf pup she's ever seen, barely breathing in a hidden desert canyon. This isn't just any wolf pup. He's the last survivor of an ancient pack that held secrets her people thought were lost forever. The little creature, no bigger than her hands, whimpers desperately as if trying to tell her something important. As Ahuli nurses him back to health, she discovers this small wolf carries a power that could heal the growing divide between her Apache tribe and the white settlers moving west. But the secret he holds will test everything she knows about family, sacrifice, and belonging. What could make a brave young girl burst into tears when she learns the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Chiricahua Mountains in shades of amber and gold, as Ahuli knelt beside the shallow creek that wound through her Apache band's camp. At 12 years old, she possessed a rare gift that set her apart from the other children, an ability to heal wounded animals that seemed to flow from her very soul. Her weathered hands, already skilled beyond her years, gently cleaned the injured wing of a red-tailed hawk she had found the previous evening. "Patience, brave one," she whispered in the ancient Apache tongue, her voice carrying the same soothing cadence her grandmother had taught her. The hawk's golden eyes fixed on hers with what seemed like understanding, its struggles gradually ceasing as her touch worked its quiet magic. The year was 1847, and the world around them grew more uncertain with each passing season. White settlers pushed ever westward, their wagon trains cutting deep scars across the sacred landscape that Ahuli's people had called home for countless generations. The Apache way of life, built on harmony with the natural world and respect for all living creatures, stood in stark contrast to the newcomers' relentless hunger for land and gold. Ahuli's camp, nestled in a protected valley where ancient cottonwoods provided shade, and the creek ran clear and cold, even in the harshest summer months. Wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made of brush and hide, dotted the landscape in careful arrangement, each family's home positioned to take advantage of the natural windbreaks and water sources. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily skyward, carrying the rich scents of roasted corn and venison. "There you are, little healer." The voice belonged to Grandmother Itzel, whose lined face held the wisdom of 7 decades spent reading the signs in wind and sky. She approached with careful steps, her worn leather medicine pouch swaying gently at her hip. This sacred bundle, passed down through 5 generations of Apache medicine women, contained herbs, stones, and other sacred items that connected its bearer to the spiritual world. Itzel settled beside her granddaughter with the practiced grace of one who had spent a lifetime moving in harmony with the earth. Her dark eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied the hawk with interest. "The creatures come to you as they once came to me," she observed, her voice carrying both pride and concern. "But these are dangerous times for those who walk between the world of humans and the world of spirits." Ahuli looked up from her patient, noting the worry lines that had deepened around her grandmother's eyes in recent months. "The hawk will fly again, grandmother. His wing was not broken, only bruised. I speak not of the hawk, child." Itzel's gnarled fingers touched the medicine pouch thoughtfully. "There are old stories, prophecies spoken by our ancestors about times when the balance between worlds would be tested, about a bridge that would appear when the need was greatest." Before Ahuli could ask what she meant, heavy footsteps announced the approach of her older brother, Nalnish. At 17, he had already proven himself as both warrior and hunter, his tall frame moving with the fluid confidence of one trained from childhood in the Apache ways. His face, usually quick to smile at his sister's antics, now wore the serious expression of a man bearing troubling news. "Sister, grandmother," he greeted them with a respectful nod, before kneeling beside the creek to splash cool water on his dust-covered face. "I bring word from the scouts. More wagon trains approach from the east, and this time they are accompanied by soldiers." Itzel's expression darkened. "How many?" "3 companies of cavalry, well armed and moving with purpose rather than mere escort duty." Nalnish glanced at Ahuli, clearly weighing how much to share in front of his younger sister. "Chief Cochise has called for a council. The elders believe these soldiers come not just to protect settlers, but to claim our lands for themselves." Ahuli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Chief Cochise, leader of their band, and a man renowned for both his strategic mind and his fierce protection of Apache territory, rarely called emergency councils. When he did, it meant their world was about to change in ways none of them could predict. The hawk in her hands shifted restlessly, as if sensing the tension that now filled the air. Ahuli stroked its feathers gently, finding comfort in the simple act of healing even as uncertainty swirled around them. She had always felt most at peace when tending to injured creatures, whether they were the horses that the Apache prized so highly or the smallest desert mice that others might consider insignificant. "What does the chief propose?" Itzel asked. Though her tone suggested she already knew, the answer would not bring comfort. "Preparation," Nalnish replied simply. "We must be ready to move our people to the high country if necessary, or to fight if they force our hand." He paused, studying his sister's downcast face. "But enough of such dark talk. Ahuli, you have not yet told us about your plans for today." Ahuli felt heat rise to her cheeks. For the past several days, she had been drawn to explore the forbidden canyon that lay beyond the eastern edge of their territory. The elders had always warned the young ones away from that place, speaking in hushed tones of ancient powers that slept in its depths. But something called to her there, a pull she could not explain or ignore. "I thought to gather healing herbs," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "The mountain sage grows thick this time of year, and grandmother's supplies grow low." Itzel's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of a woman who had raised enough children to recognize when truth was being carefully rationed. "The sage grows equally well in the meadows near camp, child. Why venture so far when danger grows closer each day? Sometimes the best medicine grows in the places others fear to go," Ahuli replied, surprising herself with the wisdom in her own words. "Is that not what you taught me, grandmother, that healing often requires courage?" A ghost of a smile crossed Itzel's weathered features. "You use my own words against me, little one. Very well, but you will take your brother's warning to heart. Stay close to known paths and return before the sun reaches its peak. These are not times for wandering alone." Nalnish stood, his hand instinctively checking the knife at his belt. "I could accompany you, sister. The council will not convene until evening." "No," Ahuli said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "You know how the animals flee when too many humans approach. I will be careful, I promise." As her brother and grandmother exchanged a meaningful look over her head, Ahuli gently placed the hawk on a low branch where it could rest safely. The bird fixed her with one final penetrating stare before settling its feathers and closing its eyes. She had the strange feeling that it was trying to tell her something, but the message remained just beyond her understanding. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythms of camp life. Women ground corn on metates, worn smooth by generations of use, their voices rising and falling in ancient songs that seemed to keep time with their work. Children played games that taught them the skills they would need as adults, tracking, hunting, and the careful observation of nature that could mean the difference between life and death in the harsh desert country. Ahuli helped her mother, Ayana, with the day's bread-making, mixing cornmeal with water from the sacred spring that bubbled up from deep in the earth. Her mother's movements were graceful and efficient, but Ahuli noticed the way her eyes frequently turned toward the eastern horizon, where dust clouds sometimes marked the passage of the wagon trains that brought their world ever closer to conflict. "Mother," Ahuli ventured as they worked. "Do you remember the old stories about the wolves?" Ayana's hands stilled for a moment in their kneading. "What brings such thoughts to your mind, daughter?" Grandmother spoke of prophecies and bridges between worlds. I wondered if the wolf stories were part of what she meant. A shadow crossed Ayana's face. "Those are very old tales, from times when our people and the wolves hunted as allies rather than competitors. Some say such partnerships were only legend, while others believe they were broken by mankind's growing distance from the natural world." She resumed her work, but her voice grew softer. "Why do you ask?" Ahuli shrugged, unable to explain the strange dreams that had visited her in recent nights. Visions of silver-eyed wolves running alongside Apache warriors, of ancient ceremonies conducted under starlit skies, of a time when the boundary between human and animal consciousness was far thinner than it had become. Just curious, I suppose. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the camp, Ahuli gathered her healing bag and water gourd, preparing for her journey to gather herbs. The leather bag, a gift from her grandmother on her 10th birthday, contained the basic tools of her trade: small bone needles for removing thorns, soft strips of hide for bandaging, and an assortment of dried plants with healing properties. Chief Cochise emerged from his wickiup as she prepared to leave, and Ahuli felt her breath catch in her throat. Even in his middle years, the chief commanded respect through sheer presence alone. His face, marked by sun and wind and the weight of leadership, turned toward her with the keen attention he gave to all things that moved through his domain. "Young healer," he called to her, his voice carrying easily across the camp. "Walk carefully today. The spirits whisper of changes coming, and those who listen to the voices of earth and sky must be especially watchful." Ahuli bowed her head respectfully. "I will remember your words, Chief." "See that you do. We cannot afford to lose those who carry the old gifts, especially now when the world grows strange around us." As she set out from camp, following a well-worn trail that led through stands of juniper and oak, Ahuli carried the chief's words with her like a talisman. The old gifts. That was how the elders referred to her ability with animals, as if it were something inherited from a distant past, rather than simply a talent she had developed through practice and patience. The desert country spread before her, in all its harsh beauty, a landscape that could kill the unwary but nurtured those who understood its rhythms. Barrel cacti stood like sentinels among the creosote bushes, their waxy surfaces already storing water against the heat of the coming day. In the distance, the mountains rose in purple layers, their peaks still touched with snow despite the warming season. As she walked, Ahuli found her steps leading not toward the herb-rich meadows near camp, but toward the mysterious canyon that had called to her so persistently. She told herself she would gather the sage her grandmother needed first, but with each step, the pull of that forbidden place grew stronger. The trail she followed had been worn by countless generations of Apache feet, a path that spoke of hunting, parties and vision quests, of young people venturing forth to find their place in the great web of existence. Soon, however, she would leave this familiar route behind and venture into territory that few of her people dared to explore. The sun climbed steadily overhead as Ahuli walked, its heat beginning to penetrate even the protective shade of her wide-brimmed hat. Hawks circled high above, riding the thermals that rose from the warming earth, and she took their presence as a good omen. The hawk she had healed that morning was probably still resting safely in camp, but these wild cousins reminded her that the natural world continued its ancient cycles regardless of human concerns. A roadrunner darted across her path, pausing, only long enough to fix her with one bright eye before disappearing into a thicket of mesquite. Ahuli smiled at the sight, remembering her grandmother's teaching that roadrunners brought messages from the spirit world. Perhaps this one carried news of the adventure that awaited her in the Forbidden Canyon, though whether that news would prove good or ill remained to be seen. The familiar sounds of camp life faded behind her as she walked deeper into the wilderness. replaced by the subtle music of the desert, the rustle of small creatures moving through dry grass, the whisper of wind through stone arches carved by countless years of patient erosion, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk, announcing its presence to any who cared to listen. Ahead of her, the landscape began to change as she approached the canyon's hidden entrance, marked by a smooth river stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. This sacred canyon stone had been placed there by ancestors whose names were lost to time, a marker that warned the wise to proceed with caution and respect. Ahuli paused beside the stone, placing her palm against its sun-warmed surface and feeling a strange vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced before, as if the stone itself were alive and aware of her presence. Beyond the marker, the canyon entrance gaped like an open mouth, its shadows promising both mystery and danger in equal measure. Ahuli took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and stepped across the threshold into a world that would change her life forever. The canyon walls rose around Ahuli like the ribs of some enormous creature, their red sandstone surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water. Ancient petroglyphs adorned the stone, spirals, and animal figures that spoke of ceremonies conducted here long before her grandparents walked the earth. The air felt different in this sacred space, thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand upright. She had been walking for nearly an hour when she heard it, a sound so faint it might have been the wind, yet so distinctly alive that it stopped her in her tracks. A whimper, weak and desperate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the canyon's shadowed recesses. Following the sound, Ahuli picked her way carefully over loose stones and around towering boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls centuries ago. The deeper she ventured, the stronger grew the sensation that she was being watched, though whether by friendly or hostile eyes she could not say. Her grandmother's warnings about the old powers that dwelt in this place echoed in her mind, but the pitiful crying ahead drew her forward, despite her growing unease. In a small alcove protected by an overhanging ledge of rock, she found him. The wolf pup was so tiny that at first she thought he might be a coyote kit, but the proportions were wrong. The massive paws, the broad head, the distinctive facial markings all spoke of wolf lineage. More shocking still was his size. In all her 12 years, during which she had encountered wolves both in the wild and in the stories of her elders, Ahuli had never seen or heard of a pup so small. He could have fit easily in her cupped hands, but it was not his size alone that made her gasp and drop to her knees beside him. Around his neck, barely visible beneath his silver-grey fur, was a collar of the finest workmanship she had ever seen. The metal, if metal it was, gleamed like moonlight on water and bore intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance before her eyes. The markings were clearly Apache in origin, yet unlike any writing she had learned from the tribal elders. The pup lay on his side, flanks barely rising and falling with each labored breath. His eyes, when they fluttered open to look at her, were not the yellow or brown she expected, but a startling silver that matched his unusual collar. Those eyes held an intelligence that sent a shiver down Ahuli's spine. Not the simple awareness of an animal, but something deeper, older, more complex. "What are you, little one?" she whispered, carefully scooping him into her arms. His body was warm, but far too light, as if whatever had brought him to this state had drained away not just his strength, but his very substance. The pup's mouth moved weakly, and she could have sworn she heard actual words rather than mere animal sounds. Impossible, of course, but the sensation was so strong that she found herself leaning closer to listen. "Please," the sound seemed to say, though she knew it must be her imagination playing tricks in this strange place. "Help me!" Ahuli's hands shook as she examined the tiny creature more closely. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his nose dry and hot with fever. Using techniques her grandmother had taught her, she gently palpated his small body, searching for broken bones or open wounds. What she found defied explanation. The pup appeared physically unharmed, yet clearly dying from some malady that went deeper than flesh and bone. The mysterious collar drew her attention again. As she studied it more closely, the symbols seemed to rearrange themselves, forming patterns that tugged at some half-remembered knowledge buried deep in her mind. Her grandmother had sometimes spoken of the old writing, the sacred marks that could only be read by those who had undergone the deepest mysteries of Apache spiritual training. Without quite meaning to, Ahuli reached out and touched the collar with one finger. The moment her skin made contact with the strange metal, the world exploded into light and sound and sensation that overwhelmed her senses completely. Visions cascaded through her mind like a waterfall of memories that were not her own. She saw wolves running alongside Apache warriors under starlit skies, their howls harmonizing with human voices raised in ancient songs. She witnessed ceremonies conducted in this very canyon, where men and women danced around sacred fires, while great silver-eyed wolves looked on with approval and understanding. More disturbing were the recent images, scenes of systematic slaughter that made her stomach clench with horror. Soldiers in blue uniforms pursuing wolf packs with ruthless efficiency, gunshots echoing across vast landscapes as the ancient alliance between her people and the wolves was severed forever. She saw the last great pack making their final stand. In a box canyon not far from where she now knelt, their defiant howls cut short by the thunder of military rifles. Through it all, one image remained constant, this tiny pup, somehow surviving when all his kin had perished, carrying within his small form the accumulated wisdom and memory of his entire lineage. He was not just a wolf, she realized with growing wonder and terror. He was the living repository of an ancient magic that connected Apache and wolf in bonds that transcended the merely physical. The vision faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Ahuli gasping and disoriented. The pup in her arms had grown still, his silver eyes fixed on her face with an expression that spoke of desperate hope. She understood now why he had been brought to this sacred place, why the canyon's ancient powers had called to her so insistently. Maska, she said aloud, surprised to hear the name emerge from her lips. In the Apache tongue it meant strong, though applied to this fragile creature it seemed almost ironic. Yet somehow she knew with absolute certainty that this was his true name, the designation that connected him to powers far older than the current troubles plaguing her people. As if responding to her recognition, Maska's breathing seemed to stabilize, slightly. His eyes remained fixed on hers, and again she had the uncanny sensation that he was trying to communicate with her directly, mind to mind, rather than through the crude medium of sound. The sun had moved considerably since she entered the canyon, its light now slanting at angles that painted the rock walls in deeper shades of red and gold. Ahuli knew she should return to camp. Her grandmother would worry, and her brother might come looking for her if she delayed much longer. But how could she explain this miraculous discovery? How could she make them understand that this tiny, dying wolf pup might hold the key to her people's survival in the conflicts to come? More immediately, how could she keep Maska alive long enough to discover what role he was meant to play in the unfolding drama of their world? Drawing on every technique her grandmother had taught her, Ahuli began the delicate work of nursing the pup back to health. From her healing bag, she retrieved a small gourd of fresh water and carefully dribbled tiny amounts between his lips. Maska's tongue moved weakly to accept the moisture, and she felt a surge of hope when he managed to swallow without choking. Next came the more difficult task of finding appropriate food for a creature so young and weak. Wolf pups in the wild would nurse from their mothers for many weeks before attempting solid food, but Maska was clearly beyond such normal care. In the vision the collar had shown her, she had glimpsed knowledge that might help. ancient techniques for sustaining the mystical wolves that had once lived alongside her people. From her medicine bag, Ahuli withdrew a small bundle of dried herbs that her grandmother used for strengthening tea. These she chewed carefully, mixing them with her saliva to create a paste that would be easier for the pup to digest. The taste was bitter and astringent, but she had seen her grandmother use this technique to feed orphaned animals too young. For solid food, Maska accepted the herbal paste with more enthusiasm than he had shown for the water, his tiny tongue working eagerly to consume every bit she offered. As he ate, Ahuli noticed that his silver eyes seemed to grow brighter, as if some inner light was being rekindled by her care. The afternoon wore on as she tended to him, using every skill she possessed to stabilize his condition. She created a soft nest from the spare clothing in her pack, positioned to take advantage of the alcove's protection, while still allowing him access to the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canyon's opening above. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in deeper shades of crimson and purple, Ahuli faced the difficult decision of what to do next. She could not leave Maska here alone. In his weakened state, he would not survive the cold of the desert night. Yet bringing him back to camp would require explanations she was not prepared to give. The tribal elders had clear laws about the proper procedures for significant spiritual encounters. Any discovery of this magnitude should be reported immediately to Chief Cochise and the Council of Medicine People, but something deep in her heart warned against such exposure. The visions had shown her how the wolf packs had been systematically hunted to near extinction. Until she better understood Maska's nature and purpose, revealing his existence might only ensure his destruction. As if sensing her internal struggle, the pup stirred in his improvised bed and fixed her with those remarkable silver eyes. This time, the communication between them was unmistakable. Not words exactly, but a clear transmission of thought and emotion that bypassed the normal channels of speech entirely. "Trust," the message seemed to say. "Hide me until the time comes to reveal the truth. Great changes approach, and I must be ready." Ahuli nodded slowly, accepting the weight of responsibility that settled on her young shoulders like a heavy cloak. She would protect this mysterious creature, even if it meant deceiving her beloved family and tribal elders. The visions had shown her glimpses of a larger destiny that she did not yet fully understand, but she knew with bone-deep certainty that Maska's survival was crucial to whatever was coming. Carefully wrapping the pup in the softest cloth from her pack, Ahuli prepared for the journey back to camp. She would have to be clever about concealing him, and even cleverer about explaining her long absence. But as she looked down into those ancient silver eyes, she felt a strength and determination that she had never experienced before. The smallest wolf pup ever seen had chosen her as his protector and ally. Whatever secrets lay hidden in that mystical collar, whatever powers slumbered in his tiny form, whatever destiny awaited them both, she would face it all with courage her grandmother would be proud of. The sacred canyon stone glowed softly in the fading light as she passed it on her way back toward camp, carrying her precious burden and the beginning of a bond that would change the fate of two worlds. The return journey to camp tested every ounce of Ahuli's ingenuity. Maska remained hidden within the folds of her healing bag, his breathing now steady enough that she dared hope he might survive the night. The silver collar around his neck seemed to pulse with a faint light that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat, visible only when she peered into the bag's shadowed interior. As the familiar sounds of camp life reached her ears, the laughter of children, the rhythmic pounding of corn being ground, the soft nickering of horses, Ahuli felt the weight of her deception settling heavily on her conscience. She had never kept secrets from her family before, especially not from grandmother Itzel, whose wise eyes seemed capable of seeing straight through to a person's soul. "Ahuli," her mother's voice carried across the camp, tinged with the worry that came naturally to any parent in these uncertain times. Where have you been? The sun grows low, and your brother was ready to set out searching for you." "I am sorry, mother," Ahuli called back, forcing her voice to remain steady. "The sage grew scarce in the usual places, and I had to venture farther than planned." She held up a hastily gathered bundle of herbs to support her story, grateful that she had remembered to collect them during her return journey. Nalnish emerged from the family wickiup, his expression shifting from concern to relief as he spotted his sister. "Next time, tell someone if you plan to wander so far," he said, though his tone held more affection than anger. "These are dangerous days for traveling alone." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose from the eastern edge of camp. Riders approached, Apache scouts returning from patrol with news that brought grim faces and hurried conversations among the adults. Ahuli used the distraction to slip into the family dwelling, where she quickly arranged a sleeping place for Maska. In the darkest corner, concealed behind baskets of corn and bundles of dried meat, the pup stirred weakly as she settled him onto a soft deer skin, his silver eyes opening to fix on her face with that unsettling intelligence she was beginning to recognize. Without thinking, she reached out to stroke his tiny head and again felt the strange connection that seemed to link their minds. "Safe," came the wordless communication. "Thank you. Rest now, little one," she whispered. "Tomorrow we will begin to understand what destiny has brought us together." The evening meal passed in a blur of worried conversations and speculation about the scouts' report. Colonel Marcus Whitmore of the United States Cavalry had established a fortified camp barely 2 days' ride from Apache territory. His forces well-equipped and clearly preparing for extended operations rather than simple escort duty. "They do not come merely to protect wagon trains," Chief Cochise announced to the gathered families. His weathered face showed the strain of leadership in troubled times, but his voice remained steady and authoritative. "The scouts report military. Engineers surveying the land, making maps of water sources and mountain passes. These are the actions of men planning conquest, not protection." Grandmother Itzel leaned forward from her place by the fire, her ancient eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "The old prophecies speak of such times," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its age-weakened tone. "When the balance between worlds hangs by the thinnest thread, when the bonds that once united all living things strain near to breaking." Ahuli felt Maska stir in his hiding place, as if responding to her grandmother's words even from across the camp. The connection between them had grown stronger throughout the evening, allowing her to sense his emotional state even when he was out of sight. Right now, he felt alert and anxious, as if the adults' conversation held meaning for him beyond simple animal understanding. "Tell us more of these prophecies, grandmother," Chief Cochise requested, with the respect due to one who carried the wisdom of generations. Itzel's gnarled fingers moved to touch the medicine pouch at her side, its worn leather, surface marked with symbols that seemed to echo those Ahuli had seen on Maska's collar. The ancient ones spoke of a time when the wolf speakers would return, when the bridge between human and animal consciousness would be rebuilt from the ashes of war and hatred. They said such a time would be marked by great suffering, but also by the appearance of one who could heal the wounds between worlds. A shiver ran down Ahuli's spine as she listened. The term wolf speaker resonated in her mind like an echo from the visions the silver collar had shown her. In those ancient scenes, she had witnessed Apache shamans who could communicate directly with the great wolves, sharing thoughts and even sensory experiences across the species divide. "Pretty stories," muttered one of the younger warriors, a hot-headed man named Tarek who favored immediate action over patient strategy. "But stories will not stop cavalry charges or turn aside bullets. We need weapons and allies, not children's tales. The wise leader considers all sources of strength," Chief Cochise replied mildly, though his eyes held a warning. "Our ancestors survived for countless generations in this harsh land because they understood that power takes many forms. Some battles are won with arrows and war clubs, others with knowledge and spiritual strength. As the council continued deep into the night, Ahuli slipped away to check on her hidden charge. Maska was awake, his silver eyes gleaming in the darkness like twin stars. When she knelt beside him, the mental connection between them flared to life with startling intensity. Images flooded her mind, not the distant visions of ancient times she had experienced before, but immediate, urgent communications. Through Maska's enhanced senses, she perceived things beyond normal human awareness. The scent signatures of the approaching cavalry carried information about their numbers, their weapons, their intentions. The vibrations traveling through the earth spoke of heavy wagons and artillery pieces being moved into position. Most disturbing of all were the traces of recent wolf scent that Maska's acute nose detected on the wind. Not living wolves, but the lingering odor of death and blood that marked the sites of recent slaughter. The systematic extermination of his kind was continuing, even as the human conflicts escalated. "They hunt us to break the old bonds," came Maska's mental voice, clearer now than it had been in the canyon. "Without the wolves, your people lose connection to the land itself. We are the bridge they seek to burn." Ahuli's hands trembled as the full implications became clear. The cavalry's mission was not simply to claim Apache territory, it was to sever the spiritual connections that gave her people their strength and identity. By eliminating the wolves, they hoped to weaken Apache resistance on a level deeper than mere military tactics could achieve. "But you survived," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his silver fur. "You carry the memories and the power. Can it be rebuilt?" "Perhaps," Maska replied, his mental tone heavy with uncertainty, "but I am still weak, still small. The collar sustains me, but I must grow in strength and wisdom before the old bonds can be renewed. And such growth requires more than food and shelter." "What do you need?" The images that answered her question were complex and sometimes frightening. Maska showed her hidden caves deep in the canyon where ancient ceremonies had once been conducted, places where the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. He showed her other wolves, survivors like himself, scattered and hiding throughout the vast wilderness, waiting for a sign that the time of renewal had come. Most challenging of all, he showed her the need for allies among her own people, Apache. Men and women who remembered the old ways and were willing to risk everything to restore them. Such individuals would be rare and hard to identify, especially when the immediate survival of the tribe demanded focus on more practical concerns. As dawn approached, Ahuli made her way back to her sleeping furs, with her mind spinning from all she had learned. The small wolf pup, hidden in the corner of their dwelling, was far more than a simple animal in need of rescue. He was the key to powers that could either save her people or lead them to destruction, depending on how wisely those powers were wielded. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of silver-eyed wolves running beside Apache warriors across landscapes both beautiful and terrible. In the morning, she would have to begin the delicate task of caring for Maska while concealing his true nature from everyone around her, including the beloved family members whose wisdom and love had shaped her entire life. The greatest test of her young life was just beginning, and failure would mean not just her own destruction, but the loss of humanity's last chance to heal the wounds that threatened to destroy both civilization and the natural world itself. 3 days had passed since Ahuli brought Maska back to camp, and the tiny wolf pup's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Each morning when she checked his hiding place, he seemed larger and stronger, his silver eyes brighter and more alert. The mysterious collar around his neck pulsed with gentle light whenever she touched it, and their mental connection grew deeper with each passing hour. But keeping such a momentous secret was taking its toll on the young Apache girl. She found herself jumping at shadows, constantly worried that someone would discover her hidden charge. Worse yet, she could sense that Grandmother Itzel was growing suspicious of her frequent absences and distracted behavior. On this particular morning, Ahuli had risen before dawn to tend to Maska before the rest of the family stirred. She found him not only awake, but sitting upright, his tiny head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. The moment she knelt beside him, urgent images flooded her mind through their psychic connection. Danger approaches. Maska's mental voice carried a note of alarm that sent ice through her veins. Men with the smell of metal and gunpowder. They seek something in the canyon where you found me. Ahuli's blood ran cold. If soldiers were investigating the sacred canyon, they might discover evidence of her presence there. Or worse, they might be following some lead related to the wolf extermination campaign that had claimed Maska's pack. How many? She whispered, though she knew he would respond through thought rather than sound. The images that came in reply showed her a small patrol of cavalry soldiers, led by a man whose presence radiated cold authority even in Maska's mental projection. This officer wore the insignia of a colonel, and something about his bearing suggested both intelligence and ruthless determination. Colonel Marcus Whitmore came Maska's identification, the name carrying overtones of fear and hatred that spoke to terrible deeds committed against his kind. Ahuli had heard that name spoken around the council fires in recent days. Whitmore was the cavalry commander who had established the fortified camp near Apache territory, the man Chief Cochise believed was planning conquest rather than simple protection of settlers. If he was personally investigating the sacred canyon, it meant her discovery of Maska was part of something much larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. "Sister?" Nalnish's voice from the wiki-up entrance made her heart leap into her throat. "Are you well? You seem troubled of late." Quickly arranging a blanket to better conceal Maska, Ahuli rose to face her brother with what she hoped was a natural expression. "I am fine, brother. Just worried about the news from the scouts." Nalnish studied her face with the sharp attention of a warrior trained to read danger in the slightest details. "It is more than that, I think. You have been secretive, distracted. Mother has noticed as well." He paused, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Whatever burden you carry, you need not bear it alone. Family shares both joys and sorrows." The temptation to confess everything was almost overwhelming. Nalnish was not just her brother, but one of the finest warriors in their band, skilled in both combat and strategy. If anyone could help her protect Maska and understand the implications of his existence, it would be him. But the images Maska had shared of the approaching patrol made her hesitate. The fewer people who knew about the wolf pup, the better his chances of remaining hidden until he was strong enough to fulfill whatever destiny awaited him. "I appreciate your concern, brother," she said carefully. "Perhaps when the current troubles pass, we can speak more freely. For now, I ask only for your trust and patience." Before Nalnish could respond, a commotion arose from the center of camp. Voices shouted warnings, and the sound of running feet suggested urgent news arriving from the scout network that Chief Cochise maintained throughout Apache territory. Brother and sister emerged from the wiki-up to find the entire camp gathering around a young warrior whose horse bore the dust and sweat of hard travel. The scout's face was grim as he delivered his report to the assembled tribal council. "Colonel Whitmore has divided his forces," the young man announced without preamble. "One company continues toward our main camps, but a smaller patrol rides toward the sacred canyons under the colonel's personal command. They carry strange devices, metal instruments that one of our people who once worked for the army recognizes as surveying equipment." Chief Cochise stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of deep concern. What could they hope to survey? In that desolate country, there are no water sources there valuable enough to justify military interest. Grandmother Itzel's voice cut through the murmured discussions like a blade. "Unless they seek something other than water or grazing land, Her ancient eyes turned toward Ahuli with an intensity that made the young girl feel as if her grandmother could see straight through to her hidden secrets. "What do you mean, honored elder?" the chief asked respectfully. "The old stories speak of treasures buried in the sacred places, not gold or silver, but knowledge and power that could shift the balance between our peoples and the newcomers." Itzel's gnarled fingers worked nervously at her medicine pouch. "If the soldiers have learned of such things from captured warriors or cooperative traders, they might seek to claim them before we can act to protect them." The crowd stirred uneasily at this suggestion. Most Apache held complicated relationships with the ancient powers said to dwell in the sacred canyons, respectful but cautious, acknowledging their existence while preferring to leave them undisturbed. Except in times of greatest need, Ahuli felt Maska's presence in her mind grow stronger, his mental voice urgent with new information. Through his enhanced senses, he was detecting something that the human scouts had missed. A second group moving through the desert. This one consisting of Apache warriors, but following patterns that suggested they were not part of any authorized tribal patrol. The images Maska shared showed her men she recognized as members of Tarak's war society, the hot-headed young warriors who favored immediate action against the cavalry threat. They were moving toward the sacred canyon as well, apparently planning some kind of preemptive strike against Whitmore's patrol. A trap within a trap. Maska's mental communication carried overtones of ancient wolf wisdom about the nature of predators. "And prey. The colonel seeks something specific in the canyon, but your warriors seek only to strike at their enemies. Neither group understands what they truly face." Ahuli realized with growing horror that a three-way collision was approaching. Cavalry soldiers searching for Apache secrets, young Apache warriors seeking to protect their territory through violence, and hidden in the center of it all, a tiny wolf pup whose very existence represented the key to powers that none of the human participants truly understood. "Chief Cochise," she found herself saying before she could think better of it. "Perhaps we should send someone to observe the sacred canyon before making any decisions about how to respond." The chief's keen eyes fixed on her with sudden interest. "An interesting suggestion, young healer. Do you volunteer for such a dangerous mission?" The entire camp fell silent, waiting for her response. Ahuli felt the weight of dozens of gazes, including her brother's startled stare and her grandmother's penetrating attention. In her mind, Maska's presence pulsed with urgent warning, revealing too much could destroy them both. Yet she could not stand by and watch as ignorance and aggression led to a disaster that might destroy not only human lives, but the last hope of restoring the ancient balance between civilizations and the natural world. "I know the canyon paths well," she said, choosing her words with extreme care. "And animals trust me in ways they do not trust others. I could approach unseen and report what the soldiers truly seek." "Absolutely not," Nalnish declared immediately. "It is far too dangerous for someone so young to venture near armed cavalry patrols." But Chief Cochise held up a hand for silence, his expression thoughtful. "The girl has shown wisdom beyond her years, and her gift with animals is well known among us. Perhaps there is merit in sending one who could move through that country without alarming the creatures whose distress might betray a normal scout's presence." As the debate continued around her, Ahuli felt Maska's mental touch grow warmer with what might have been approval. The wolf pup understood, as she was beginning to, that their fates were intertwined with the larger struggle for the future of both their peoples. Whatever happened in the sacred canyon would determine not just the immediate outcome of the conflict between Apache and cavalry, but the very possibility of healing the wounds that human expansion had torn in the fabric of the natural world. The time for hiding was nearly over. Soon, both she and Maska would have to step forward and claim their roles in a destiny that neither of them fully understood, but both were beginning to accept as their responsibility to fulfill. The council debate raged for hours before Chief Cochise finally made his decision. Ahuli would return to the sacred canyon, but not alone. Nalnish would accompany her as both protector and witness to whatever they might discover. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it offered the best chance of learning Whitmore's true intentions without triggering the kind of open conflict that could destroy the entire Apache band. As preparations for the mission began, Grandmother Eitzel drew Ahuli aside with a gesture that brooked no argument. The old woman's weathered hands shook slightly as she retrieved an object from deep within her medicine pouch, a carved flute made from what appeared to be bone, its surface decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering firelight. "This belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," Itzel said, her voice heavy with the weight of generations. "It is called the Spirit Bone Flute, and it was carved from the leg bone of a great wolf who gave his life willingly, so that the music might bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness." Ahuli accepted the flute with trembling hands, feeling the strange warmth that seemed to pulse within the ancient bone. The moment her fingers touched the carved surface, she heard, or perhaps felt, a faint melody that resonated not in her ears but deep in her soul. "Grandmother," she whispered, "how did you know I would need this?" Itzel's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied her granddaughter's face with an intensity that made Ahuli feel completely transparent. "Because I have been having the dreams too, child. Visions of silver-eyed wolves and ancient ceremonies, of bonds broken and waiting to be reborn. The spirits do not whisper such things to only one person when great changes approach." The revelation that her grandmother shared some version of the mystical experiences she had been having sent waves of relief and terror through Ahuli in equal measure. Relief, because she was no longer completely alone with her impossible secret. Terror, because it meant the situation was even more serious than she had imagined. "The old prophecies speak of this time," Itzel continued, her gnarled fingers tracing the flute's carved patterns, "when the wolf speaker would arise to heal the wounds between worlds. I had hoped it would not be in my lifetime, and certainly not fall to one so young. But the spirits care nothing for our convenience or comfort." That evening, as the camp settled into the watchful quiet that had become their new normal, Ahuli slipped away to where Maska waited in his hidden sanctuary. The wolf pup had grown remarkably in the days since she found him, still tiny by normal standards, but no longer the barely breathing creature she had discovered in the canyon. His silver eyes gleamed with intelligence and something that might have been anticipation. When she showed him the spirit bone flute, Maska's entire body went rigid with attention. His mental voice, when it came, carried overtones of recognition and ancient memory that spoke to knowledge far older than his physical form suggested. The song of calling, he identified, his psychic communication heavy with reverence. With that instrument, the old wolf speakers could summon our kind from vast distances, speak thoughts across the spaces between minds, even share the deep memories that connect all wolves to the great pack of the ancestors. "Can you teach me to use it?" Ahuli asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complex than a simple yes or no. The images that flooded her mind in response showed her glimpses of training that might take years to complete under normal circumstances. Complex breathing techniques, meditation practices that opened channels of consciousness most humans never experienced, and most challenging of all, the development of empathic abilities that would allow her to truly understand the animal mind. Normally, such learning requires seasons of careful preparation, Masker explained, his mental tone thoughtful. But these are not normal times, and you already possess natural gifts that would take others lifetimes to develop. The collar that sustains me can also accelerate your training, though the process will be intense. What do you mean by intense? The wolf pup's silver eyes seemed to glow brighter as he prepared to show her. Touch the collar while holding the flute, and I will share not just knowledge, but direct experience. You will see through wolf eyes, smell through wolf nose, think with wolf mind. but such sharing leaves permanent changes in human consciousness. Once begun, the path of the wolf speaker cannot be undone. Ahuli hesitated for only a moment before reaching out to touch both the ancient flute and Maska's mysterious collar simultaneously. The world dissolved around her in a cascade of sensation beyond anything she had ever imagined. Suddenly, she was seeing through multiple sets of eyes at once. Not just Maska's, but those of wolves scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Some were old, their minds heavy with the weight of years and loss. Others were young, their thoughts bright with curiosity and hope. All were connected by bonds of pack loyalty and shared memory that transcended the boundaries of individual consciousness. Through this vast network of lupine awareness, she perceived the true scope of the catastrophe that had befallen the wolf. Populations. Whitmore's campaign had been systematic and thorough, targeting not just random packs, but specifically those wolves who carried the genetic and spiritual heritage of the ancient human-wolf alliance. It was a calculated attempt to sever connections that had existed since the dawn of both species, but the vision also showed her something that filled her heart with hope. Scattered throughout the wilderness were survivors like Maska, wolves, who carried within their blood and consciousness the potential to rebuild what had been destroyed. They waited in hidden places, responding to dreams and instincts they did not fully understand, sensing that the time of renewal approached, but uncertain how to answer the call. "Now you see," Maska's mental voice said as the overwhelming flood of sensation gradually subsided, "the true nature of what we face. This is not simply a conflict between your people and the cavalry, but a war for the very soul of the relationship between humanity and the natural world." Ahuli found herself back in her own body, but forever changed by the experience. Her senses seemed sharper, more attuned to subtle sounds and scents that had previously escaped her notice. More importantly, she could feel the presence of other wolves in the distance, faint but unmistakable connections that tugged at her consciousness like invisible threads, bring both hope and sorrow. "Perhaps 24 scattered across the territory your people call home," Maska replied. "Enough to rebuild, if they can be brought together and taught to trust again. But first, we must prevent Whitmore from completing his mission in the sacred canyon." "What is his mission? What does he seek there?" The images that answered her question filled her with cold dread. Through sources she could not identify, captured Apache warriors, cooperative traders, or perhaps simple archaeological observation, Whitmore had learned of the existence of the Wolf Grounds, the sacred burial site where generations of the Great Alliance wolves had been laid to rest. More importantly, he had discovered that the site contained artifacts and knowledge that could either restore the ancient bonds or destroy them forever. "If he reaches the inner sanctum and destroys the songstones," Maska explained, sharing visions of crystalline formations that hummed with trapped music from ancient ceremonies, "the spiritual foundation for any future alliance will crumble. No wolf speaker will ever arise again, and my kind will fade into simple animals with no memory of what we once were." The weight of responsibility that settled on Ahuli's shoulders felt heavier than mountains. Not only was she tasked with protecting Maska and developing her own abilities as a wolf speaker, but the fate of an ancient spiritual tradition rested in her untested hands. "The flute," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "It's not just for communication, is it? It's a key." "Yes," Maska confirmed, his mental tone heavy with approval. "The songstones can only be activated by one who carries both. Human consciousness and wolf awareness, playing the ancient melodies on an instrument that bridges both worlds. Your grandmother's gift is more precious than she perhaps realizes. It may be the only such flute remaining in existence." As dawn approached, Ahuli carefully concealed both the flute and Maska before rejoining her family for the morning meal. Nulnish watched her with growing concern, clearly sensing the changes in his sister, even if he could not identify their source. "You seem different," he observed quietly as they prepared their weapons and supplies for the journey to the canyon. More focused, but also more burdened. What has changed? I understand more about what we face, Ahuli replied, which was true even if it was far from the complete truth. And I realize the stakes are higher than any of us imagined. Her brother studied her face with the intensity of a warrior reading terrain before battle. Higher how? The canyon holds more than military significance, she said carefully. If the soldiers succeed in whatever they plan there, the damage to our people will go far beyond mere territorial loss. Before Nalnish could press for more details, Chief Kachis approached with final instructions for their mission. The tribal leader's weathered face showed the strain of leadership in impossible times, but his voice remained steady and authoritative. You will observe but not engage, unless absolutely necessary for your own survival, he commanded. Whatever Whitmore seeks in that sacred place, we must understand his intentions before deciding how to respond. The future of our people may depend on the intelligence you bring back. As they set out from camp, Ahuli carried with her not only the visible burden of weapons and supplies, but the hidden weight of the spirit-bone flute and the knowledge that a tiny wolf pup's destiny was intertwined with her own. The mental connection to Maska remained strong, even as distance grew between them, a constant reminder of the responsibilities she had accepted and the powers she was only beginning to understand. The sacred canyon awaited, holding within its ancient walls the key to either restoration or final destruction of bonds that had existed since the dawn of time. Whatever they discovered, they would determine not just the immediate fate of Apache and cavalry, but the very possibility of healing a world torn apart by fear, greed, and the tragic failure of different peoples to understand their fundamental connections to each other and to the earth they all shared. The journey to the sacred canyon took most of the day, with Ahuli and Nalnish moving carefully through terrain that offered both concealment and clear views of the surrounding desert. The heightened senses that had resulted from her connection with Maska allowed Ahuli to detect signs of passage that would have been invisible to her before. The faint scent of horses and men carried on the wind, the subtle disturbances in sand and stone that marked recent travel. As they approached the canyon's entrance, they discovered they were not the first to arrive. Smoke rose from multiple campsites, and the sound of voices echoed off the rock walls in patterns that suggested at least 3 separate groups had converged on this sacred space. Nalnish's hand moved instinctively to his war club as they took shelter behind a formation of wind-carved boulders. "Cavalry, as expected," he whispered, pointing to where uniformed soldiers had established a disciplined camp near the canyon mouth. "But those others? I count at least 6 Apache warriors, and they're not from our band." Ahuli's enhanced hearing caught fragments of conversation that confirmed her worst fears. Tarek and his war society had indeed come seeking a fight, their weapons ready, and their intentions focused solely on driving the soldiers away through force of arms. They had no understanding of the greater forces at work in this place, no knowledge of what their violent intervention might destroy. "Brother," she said urgently, "we must find a way to speak with both groups before they—" Her words were cut short by a new voice, one that carried the crisp authority of military command, even across the considerable distance between their hiding place and the cavalry camp. Colonel Marcus Whitmore had arrived, and he was clearly taking personal charge of whatever operation his men had been conducting. Through her connection to Maska, Ahuli found herself able to perceive details about the colonel that normal human senses would have missed. He carried the scent of wolf blood on his clothing and weapons, not recent kills, but the accumulated residue of many such encounters over time. More disturbing still was an aura of cold determination that seemed to radiate from him like winter wind, speaking to a man who had dedicated himself to a cause with absolute conviction. "Set up the surveying equipment near the inner wall," Whitmore commanded, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustic environment. The Apache tales speak of songs trapped in stone. If such things exist, our instruments should be able to detect the resonant frequencies. Ahuli's blood ran cold as she realized the colonel knew far more about the sacred canyon's secrets than anyone had suspected. Someone had provided him with detailed information about the song stones and their significance to Apache spiritual traditions. How could he know such things? Nalnish whispered, his own shock evident in his tight voice. Before Ahuli could respond, a new figure emerged from the cavalry camp. A man whose bearing and equipment marked him as a civilian rather than a soldier, despite his presence with the military expedition. This individual carried what appeared to be medical supplies, along with surveying instruments, and something about his posture suggested discomfort with his current circumstances. Through her enhanced perception, Ahuli detected something unexpected. About this civilian, beneath the scents of metal and gunpowder that clung to all members of the expedition, he carried traces of Apache herbs and traditional medicines. More intriguingly, his emotional emanations carried overtones of conflict and regret, rather than the cold determination that characterized the colonel. "Dr. Samuel Hayes," came Maska's mental voice across the distance that separated them. The wolf. Pup's supernatural awareness extending even to this remote location. He has treated Apache wounded in secret, though he travels with their enemies. His heart is divided between duty to his brother and loyalty to his principles. "His brother," Ahuli whispered, though she knew Nalnish could not hear Maska's mental communications. "The colonel. They share blood, but not philosophy. The doctor seeks to heal what the soldier would destroy." This revelation opened new possibilities that Ahuli had not considered. If Dr. Hayes could be separated from the military expedition and approached diplomatically, he might provide crucial intelligence about Whitmore's plans, or even be turned into an ally against his own brother's destructive mission. But before she could fully develop this line of thinking, movement from the Apache position demanded her immediate attention. Tarek and his warriors were preparing for action, their weapons ready and their formation suggesting an imminent attack on the cavalry camp. "They'll be slaughtered," Nalnish observed grimly. 6 warriors against a full cavalry patrol, with the soldiers holding superior position and firepower. It will be a massacre. Ahuli knew her brother was right, but she also understood something he could not, that the real tragedy would not be the loss of Apache lives, terrible as that would be, but the destruction of the song stones that would occur if the fighting reached the canyon's inner sanctum. Whitmore's surveying equipment was already positioned to locate and examine the ancient crystalline formations. If combat erupted around them, stray bullets or deliberate sabotage could destroy humanity's last chance to restore the ancient alliance. From her concealed position, she could see all 3 groups converging on a disaster that none of them fully understood. The cavalry sought to claim and possibly destroy sacred artifacts, whose true significance they knew only from fragmentary accounts. The Apache warriors planned to drive off the soldiers through violence that would likely trigger exactly the kind of destruction they hoped to prevent. And hidden in the complex dynamics between military duty and personal conscience, Dr. Hayes represented a potential bridge between opposing forces, if only someone could reach him before the shooting started. The spirit bone flute, concealed in her medicine bag, seemed to pulse with warmth against her side. Through her connection to Maska, she could sense other wolves beginning to respond to some supernatural call that originated from the sacred canyon itself. The songstones were already beginning to resonate with ancient harmonies, awakened by the proximity of both human consciousness and lupine awareness. The time of hiding is ending. Maska's mental voice carried undertones of both anticipation and fear. Soon you must choose whether to reveal yourself and attempt to unite these fractured forces, or watch as ignorance and hatred destroy what cannot be rebuilt. Nalnish turned to his sister with an expression that mixed protective concern with growing recognition that she was somehow central to the unfolding crisis. "You know more about this place than you have told me," he said quietly, "and I suspect your knowledge extends beyond mere familiarity with the terrain." "Yes," Ahuli admitted, knowing that the time for partial truths was rapidly passing. "There are forces at work here that none of us fully understand, but I have been chosen, or perhaps cursed, to serve as a bridge between them." "What kind of forces?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of yet another group at the canyon entrance. These riders carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of experienced cavalry, but their uniforms and equipment marked them as different from Whitmore's expedition. Reinforcements, Nalnish wondered aloud. Through her supernatural awareness, Ahuli perceived something far more significant than simple military backup. These new arrivals carried with them traces of wolf scent and evidence of recent contact with Apache allies. They were not coming to support Whitmore's mission, but to oppose it, representing factions within the military itself that disagreed with the colonel's methods and objectives. The sacred canyon was becoming the focal point for conflicts that extended far beyond the immediate struggle between Apache bands and westward expansion. Forces were gathering that would determine the fate of human-nature relationships for generations to come, and at the center of it all stood a 12-year-old Apache girl who carried the last hope of healing wounds that threatened to destroy both civilization and the natural world. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it would come either the restoration of ancient harmony or the final severing of bonds that had connected humanity to the deeper wisdom of the earth. Since the dawn of consciousness itself, the rescue mission began at twilight, when shadows offered the best concealment for movement between the rocky formations that surrounded the sacred canyon. Ahuli and Nalnish had spent the afternoon observing the three camps, trying to understand the complex dynamics that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. What they witnessed defied all their expectations. Dr. Samuel Hayes had separated himself from the main cavalry camp and was moving carefully toward the Apache position, his hands raised in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. But instead of being met with drawn weapons, Tarek and his warriors seemed to recognize the doctor, welcoming him with cautious but genuine respect. "That makes no sense," Nalnish whispered, as they watched the impossible scene unfold. "How could Apache warriors know a cavalry physician?" Ahuli's enhanced senses caught fragments of the conversation taking place in the distance, words that began to piece together a puzzle far more complex than either of them had imagined. Dr. Hayes was speaking in fluent Apache, his accent suggesting years of practice rather than recent learning. "Because he's been treating our people in secret for months," she realized aloud. "He's been working against his own expedition, providing medical care to Apache wounded and sharing information about cavalry movements." But even this revelation paled beside what happened next. Colonel Whitmore emerged from his own camp and strode purposefully toward the meeting between his doctor and the Apache warriors. Instead of ordering his men to fire or demanding Hayes's immediate return, the colonel's voice carried across the canyon with words that shook Ahuli's understanding of everything she thought she knew. "Brother," Whitmore called out, his authoritative tone giving way to something far more personal and pained. "It's time we settled this between us once and for all." The truth hit Ahuli like a physical blow. Dr. Samuel Hayes was not just a civilian physician traveling with the cavalry, he was Colonel Marcus Whitmore's brother, and the conflict between them represented something far deeper than disagreement over military tactics. Through her connection to Muska, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The wolf pup's supernatural awareness had detected the family resemblance between the two men, but more importantly, he had sensed the emotional turmoil that both brothers carried. This was not a simple story of military duty conflicting with humanitarian impulses. It was a family torn apart by fundamentally different visions of how the expanding United States should relate to both indigenous peoples and the natural world itself. "Samuel," the colonel continued, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustic environment, "you cannot continue undermining legitimate military operations. The Apache must be relocated to reservations for their own protection, and the wolf populations must be controlled to prevent attacks on settlers." Dr. Hayes's response carried equal measures of pain and determination. "Marcus, you know as well as I do that the so-called wolf attacks are largely fiction created to justify systematic extermination. And the reservation system is designed to break Apache culture, not protect Apache lives." "You always were too idealistic," Whitmore replied, though his tone held more sorrow than anger. "The world is changing, Samuel. We can either guide that, change, or be swept away by it. There's no middle ground." "There has to be," the doctor insisted. "These people have knowledge and wisdom that could benefit everyone if we approach them as partners rather than obstacles. The old alliance between Apache and wolves represents a sustainable relationship with the land that we desperately need to understand." Ahuli felt her heart racing as she realized the true scope of what was happening. The cavalry expedition had not come to the sacred canyon solely to destroy Apache spiritual sites. It had come because Dr. Hayes had convinced his brother that the ancient knowledge stored there might hold keys to solving the conflicts between expanding civilization and environmental sustainability. But something had gone wrong. Whitmore's response revealed the tragic flaw in his brother's well-intentioned plan. "The sacred wolf grounds map stone that your Apache friends described to you does exist," the colonel admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. "But my superiors have no interest in learning from indigenous wisdom. They want the location of the burial sites so they can be excavated for any valuables and then destroyed to prevent them from becoming rallying points for resistance." The revelation struck like lightning through the tense standoff. Dr. Hayes staggered backward as if physically struck, his face showing the horror of someone who had just realized his own actions had doomed the very people he had tried to help. "You used me," he whispered, the words carrying clearly across the canyon. "You used my trust in you, my reports about Apache willingness to share their knowledge, to plan their cultural destruction. I tried to find another way," Whitmore said, his military bearing cracking to reveal genuine anguish. "But orders from Washington are clear. The Western Territories must be cleared for settlement and development. Any significant cultural or spiritual sites that might serve as focal points for resistance must be eliminated." Through her psychic connection with Muska, Ahuli felt the tiny wolf pup's distress spike to dangerous levels. The sacred wolf grounds mapstone was hidden within his mysterious collar, the very information that could lead to the destruction of everything his ancient pack had died to protect. But the revelations were not yet complete. Tarek stepped forward. From the Apache position, his war paint gleaming in the fading light as he addressed both brothers with cold fury. "You speak of us as if we are not here," he said, his English careful but clear. "As if our knowledge and our sacred places exist only for your convenience or destruction. But you understand nothing of what you threaten." The young war leader's hand moved to a bundle he carried, unwrapping it to reveal an object that made both cavalry officers step backward in shock. It was another collar, similar to the one Muska wore, but larger and somehow more complete, its silver surface covered with the same shifting symbols that had triggered Ahuli's visions. "This belonged to the great wolf who led the last pack," Tarek announced. "When the soldiers killed him, I retrieved this before they could burn his body. It contains not just maps, but the accumulated wisdom of every wolf speaker who ever lived." Colonel Whitmore's eyes fixed on the collar with an intensity that spoke to orders from superiors far more powerful than himself. "That artifact must be secured and transported to Washington for study," he said, his voice resuming its official tone even as his personal anguish remained visible. "No," Dr. Hayes said firmly, moving to stand between his brother and the Apache. "Warriors, I won't let you destroy something irreplaceable in the name of military expedience." "Samuel, step aside. That's an order from your commanding officer." "You're not my commanding officer, Marcus. You're my brother, and I'm making a choice between family loyalty and what's right for the world our children will inherit." The standoff crystallized around the two collars, one worn by a tiny wolf pup hidden back at the Apache camp, the other held by an Apache warrior determined to protect the last remnants of his people's spiritual heritage. Between them stood two brothers, whose personal conflict reflected the larger tragedy of a nation struggling to reconcile expansion with justice, progress with wisdom. Ahuli realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment Maska had been preparing her for. The ancient prophecies had spoken of a wolf speaker who would arise when the need was greatest, someone who could bridge the gap between human consciousness and natural wisdom. But they had not mentioned that such a person would have to choose between family loyalty and universal justice, between personal safety and the preservation of irreplaceable knowledge. Through her mental connection to Maska, she felt the wolf. Pup's urgent communication. The time for hiding was over. The sacred wolf grounds mapstone in his collar, combined with the great wolf's collar that Tarek now held, could either restore the ancient alliance or lead to its final destruction, depending on who controlled them and how they were used. "You must reveal yourself." Maska's mental voice carried the weight of ancient destiny. Only the presence of a true wolf speaker can prevent the three factions from destroying each other and everything we have worked to preserve. As darkness settled over the sacred canyon, Ahuli made the decision that would change not only her own life, but the fate of two worlds that had been drifting apart since the first white settlers had looked upon Apache lands and seen only resources to be exploited rather than a way of life to be respected. She would step out of hiding and claim her role as the bridge between human and natural consciousness, even if it meant risking everything she had ever known or loved. The smallest wolf pup ever seen had chosen her as his partner in this cosmic responsibility, and she would not fail him, or the countless generations whose future depended on healing the wounds that threatened to destroy both civilization and the natural world. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it would come either redemption or tragedy on a scale that none of the human participants could yet fully comprehend. Ahuli's decision to reveal herself required more courage than she had ever imagined possessing. As she prepared to leave the safety of their hiding place, Nalnish grasped her arm with gentle but firm pressure. "Sister," he said quietly, "whatever you plan to do, I can see in your eyes that it will change everything. Before you step into that canyon, tell me truly, what have you been hiding from us?" The moment of truth had arrived. Looking into her brother's concerned face, Ahuli realized that she could no longer bear the weight of her secrets alone. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told him everything, about finding Maska, about the visions, about her growing abilities as a wolf speaker, and about the destiny that seemed to be pulling her toward a confrontation she was far from certain she could survive. Nalnish listened without interruption, his expression shifting from disbelief to wonder, to a grim acceptance of responsibilities, far greater than either of them had been prepared to handle. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Show me," he said simply. Ahuli hesitated, knowing that once her brother witnessed Maska's true nature, there would be no possibility of returning to their previous life. But the sounds of growing tension from the canyon below reminded her that their previous life was already ending, whether they chose to participate in its transformation or not. From her medicine bag, she withdrew the spirit bone flute that Grandmother Itzel had entrusted to her. The ancient instrument seemed to glow with its own inner light as she raised it to her lips, and the melody that emerged was unlike anything either of them had ever heard. Not quite human music, not quite wolf song, but something that bridged both worlds with haunting beauty. The effect was immediate and startling. From the distance that separated them from the Apache camp, a howl rose in response. Not the wild cry of a random wolf, but a harmony that perfectly complemented the flute's ethereal melody. Nalnish's eyes widened as he recognized something impossible yet undeniable in that distant song. "Muska," Ahuli said as the music faded. "He responds across any distance when I play the ancient songs. And through him, I can reach other wolves scattered throughout our territory." Before her brother could respond, new howls began echoing from various points around the sacred canyon. Not just one or two voices, but a growing chorus that spoke to a gathering far larger than the three human factions had anticipated. The surviving wolves of the region were converging on this place, drawn by supernatural forces that none of the soldiers or warriors fully understood. How many? Nalnish asked, his warrior's mind already calculating the implications of this unexpected development. "Nearly 24, Ahuli replied, her enhanced senses tracking each distinct voice in the lupine symphony. "All that remain of the ancient alliance bloodlines. They come because they sense that the time of restoration has arrived, or that this is their last chance to honor the memory of their ancestors." From the canyon below, shouts of alarm arose from all three camps as the humans became aware of the wolf presence surrounding them. Colonel Whitmore's military training took over as he barked orders for defensive positions, while Tarek and his warriors readied their weapons with the fluid efficiency of men accustomed to fighting alongside nature rather than against it. But Dr. Hayes reacted differently. Instead of reaching for weapons, he stood perfectly still in the center of the canyon, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond normal human perception. When he spoke, his voice carried across the stone walls with surprising clarity. "They're not attacking," he called out to all three groups. "Listen to the pattern of their howls. It's not a hunting call or a territorial challenge. It's something else entirely." Ahuli felt a surge of hope as she realized that the doctor's years of working with Apache allies had taught him to interpret natural signs that most white men would miss entirely. If she could reach him, if she could make him understand what was truly happening, he might serve as a bridge between his brother's military mindset and the deeper wisdom that the situation required. "I have to go down there," she told Nalnish, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "The three groups will destroy each other if someone doesn't intervene, and the wolves won't approach while there's a threat of violence." "Then I go with you," her brother replied immediately. "No." Ahuli's refusal was gentle but firm. "This is something I must do alone. The prophecies speak of the wolf speaker as a single individual who bridges human and animal consciousness. If I approach with warriors at my side, the message becomes confused." Nayalnish's face showed the struggle between protective instincts and recognition of responsibilities that transcended normal family obligations. "At least take this," he said, offering her his own sacred war paint, a mixture of red clay and blessed herbs that Apache warriors used to invoke protection and spiritual strength. As Ahuli carefully applied the traditional markings to her face and arms, she felt a change come over her that went deeper than mere symbolism. The paint seemed to connect her not only to her brother's warrior spirit, but to the accumulated courage of every Apache who had ever worn such markings into battle or ceremony. Combined with her growing wolf speaker abilities, the traditional blessing created a synthesis of human and natural power unlike anything she had experienced before. "Now I understand why grandmother has been watching you so carefully," Nalnish said, as he observed his sister's transformation. "You carry something that hasn't been seen in our people for generations. Use it wisely, little sister, because the consequences of failure will extend far beyond our own lives." The descent into the canyon required all of Ahuli's enhanced senses and developing supernatural abilities. She moved through shadows and along paths that would have been invisible to normal human perception, guided by the mental connection to Maska that had grown stronger throughout the day. The wolves gathering around the canyon's perimeter maintained their distance, but tracked her movement with collective awareness that felt like a warm presence in the back of her mind. As she approached the central area where the three human factions maintained their uneasy standoff, Ahuli could see the tension that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. Colonel Whitmore had positioned his men in a defensive formation that commanded the best approaches to the canyon's inner sanctum, where his surveying equipment waited to locate and examine the ancient songstones. Tarek and his warriors held positions that would allow them to attack the cavalry with devastating effect, but at the cost of their own lives. Dr. Hayes stood alone in the space between the two groups, his medical bag in one hand and his brother's military orders in the other, torn between irreconcilable loyalties. The sacred Wolf Grounds mapstone, hidden in Maska's collar back at the Apache camp, pulsed in Ahuli's consciousness like a beacon, calling her toward a destiny she could no longer avoid. But it was the great Wolf's collar in Tarek's possession that would determine the immediate outcome of the confrontation. If the Apache warrior could be convinced to trust her with that ancient artifact, if the two collars could be brought together in the presence of a true wolf speaker, the songstones might reveal wisdom that could heal the wounds between all the conflicting factions. But first, she had to survive revealing herself to three groups of armed men whose nerves were stretched to the breaking point by the supernatural events surrounding them. Taking a deep breath and calling upon every ounce of courage that her grandmother's training and Maska's bond had instilled in her, Ahuli stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight that illuminated the center of the sacred canyon. "I am Ahuli of the Chiricahua Apache," she announced, her young voice carrying with surprising strength across the stone walls. "I come as the wolf speaker, to prevent the destruction of knowledge that belongs to all people, not just those who would claim it through conquest or defend it through violence." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the only sounds were the crackling of fires and the distant wolf howls that continued to echo from the canyon's rim. Three groups of warriors and soldiers, men trained for combat and accustomed to taking decisive action in the face of threats, found themselves confronted by a 12-year-old Apache girl who radiated a presence far beyond her physical size or apparent vulnerability. Colonel Whitmore was the first to recover from his shock. "Young woman," he said, his military training reasserting itself, "you are in extreme danger. Return to your people immediately, and we will discuss terms for—" "There will be no terms," Ahuli interrupted, her voice carrying overtones of authority that seemed to resonate from the canyon walls themselves. "There will be understanding, or there will be the destruction of something that can never be replaced. The choice belongs to all of you, but the consequences will affect generations yet unborn." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his medical instincts overriding caution as he studied the young Apache girl's bearing and manner. "You're not here by accident," he observed. "You know something about this place that the rest of us don't understand. I know that the wolves gathering around us carry the genetic memory of a time when Apache and Lupine consciousness worked together to maintain the balance between human civilization and natural wisdom," Ahuli replied. "I know that the artifacts you seek to claim or destroy contain knowledge that could help heal the wounds your people's expansion has torn in the fabric of the world itself. And I know," she continued, turning to address Tarek directly, "that the collar you carry belonged to the last great wolf, and that it must be reunited with its companion if the ancient alliance is to be restored rather than lost forever." The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed as he studied this young girl who spoke of secrets that he had thought known only to himself and the few survivors of the final Wolfpack massacre. "What companion?" he demanded, Ahuli's response would either begin the healing of ancient wounds or trigger the violent destruction of humanity's last chance to restore its broken relationship with the natural world. Everything depended on her ability to convince 3 groups of armed men to trust a 12-year-old girl with responsibilities that none of them fully comprehended. The battle began not with gunfire or war cries, but with the ancient rhythm of drum beats that seemed to emerge from the canyon walls themselves. As Ahuli reached into her medicine bag and withdrew both the spirit bone flute and a second collar, Maska's mystical artifact that she had brought from the Apache camp, the very stones around them began to resonate with harmonies that spoke to powers far older than human conflict. Impossible, Colonel Whitmore breathed as he watched the 2 collars respond to each other's proximity by glowing with silver light that illuminated the entire canyon. The reports didn't mention anything like this, but Dr. Hayes stepped closer, his scientific mind overriding his shock as he observed the phenomenon with growing wonder. Marcus, this isn't just indigenous mythology. There's real power here. Something that could revolutionize our understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the natural world. Tarak's response was more immediate and practical. The Apache warrior recognized the companion collar the moment Ahuli revealed it, and his scarred face showed the first expression of hope she had seen from him since arriving at the canyon. "The last cub," he said, his voice heavy with recognition. "We thought the tiny one had died with the rest of the pack. Where is he?" "Safe," Ahuli replied, as she began to raise the spirit bone flute to her lips. "But he will only come if he knows the ancient alliance can be restored without bloodshed. The wolves gathering around us will follow his lead. They remember the old bonds, but they will not expose themselves to betrayal again." The melody that emerged from the flute was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It began as a simple tune, reminiscent of Apache ceremonial music. But as the 2 collars' resonance joined the song, layers of harmony built upon each other, until the very air seemed to vibrate with supernatural presence. From the darkness beyond the firelight came an answering call, not the distant howl they had heard before, but the clear, bright voice of a young wolf announcing his arrival. Maska stepped into the circle of light, no longer the tiny, dying creature Ahuli had found in the canyon, but a magnificent young wolf whose silver eyes held the accumulated wisdom of his entire lineage. The transformation was breathtaking. In just the few days since his rescue, Maska had grown not only in size, but in presence, his supernatural heritage allowing him to mature at a rate that defied natural law. The collar around his neck pulsed with the same rhythm as the one Tarak held, creating a pattern of light that seemed to awaken something dormant in the canyon's ancient stones. Colonel Whitmore's military training warred with amazement as he watched the impossible scene unfold. "Samuel," he said quietly to his brother, "what are we witnessing here?" "History," Dr. Hayes replied, his voice filled with awe. "The restoration of a partnership that our civilization has spent centuries trying to destroy, but the reunion of the collars was only the beginning." As Maska moved to stand beside Ahuli, their mental connection expanded to include not just the 2 of them, but every wolf within miles of the sacred canyon. Through this expanded network of consciousness, the assembled humans began to perceive the world as the wolves experienced it, not as separate territories to be conquered or defended, but as an interconnected web of relationships that included all living things. The war drum of 2 worlds manifested not as a physical instrument, but as the synchronized heartbeat that emerged when human and lupine consciousness merged in harmony. The rhythm pulsed through the ground itself, felt in the soles of feet and the depth of bones, creating a unity of purpose that transcended the artificial divisions between species and cultures. Tarak was the first to respond to the supernatural symphony. The Apache warrior, whose life had been dedicated to protecting his people's sacred traditions, recognized in the expanding harmony the fulfillment of prophecies he had thought lost forever. Without hesitation, he placed the great wolf's collar on the ground between the two groups and stepped back, his weapons lowered in a gesture of trust. "The ancient alliance calls to us," he announced, his voice carrying clearly over the mystical drumbeat. "We can answer with the wisdom of our ancestors, or we can cling to the fears and hatreds that have brought our world to the edge of destruction." Dr. Hayes moved forward immediately, his medical training and humanitarian instincts responding to the healing potential he sensed in the unfolding ceremony. But Colonel Whitmore remained frozen between military duty and growing recognition that his orders from Washington represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the forces at work in this sacred place. "Marcus," his brother pleaded, "this is what I've been trying to tell you. The knowledge these people possess could help us build a sustainable relationship with the land, instead of just exploiting it until it's destroyed." The synchronized drumbeat grew stronger as more wolves emerged from the darkness to join the circle of light. Each arrival added new layers to the supernatural harmony, creating a crescendo of sound and sensation that seemed to awaken the very stones of the canyon walls. Through her connection with Masca and the expanding wolf network, Ahuli felt the presence of the songstones beginning to respond to the ancient rhythms. Deep within the canyon's inner sanctum, crystalline formations that had remained dormant for generations began to hum with trapped melodies from ceremonies conducted when the world was young, and the bonds between human and natural consciousness were strong and unbroken. The final confrontation was building toward a climax that would determine not just the fate of the individuals present, but the very possibility of healing the wounds that human expansion had torn in the fabric of the natural world. The final confrontation came not between humans and wolves, but between Colonel Whitmore and his own conscience as the supernatural harmony reached its peak. The war drum of two worlds had synchronized every heartbeat in the canyon, creating a unity of purpose that made deception or violence feel like violations of natural law itself. "Colonel," Ahuli said, her young voice somehow carrying absolute authority in the mystical atmosphere, "you have a choice to make. Your orders from Washington assume that Apache knowledge and wolf consciousness represent threats to be eliminated. But what if they represent solutions to problems your civilization hasn't yet learned to solve?" Whitmore's face showed the struggle of a career military officer confronting evidence that his entire worldview might be fundamentally flawed. The synchronized drumbeat made it impossible to maintain the emotional barriers that normally allowed soldiers to carry out orders without questioning their deeper implications. "The surveys," he said slowly, his voice heavy with dawning recognition. "They weren't just mapping water sources and mountain passes. They were documenting environmental damage, erosion, deforestation, the collapse of game populations. My superiors know that current expansion patterns are unsustainable." Dr. Hayes stepped closer to his brother, hope flickering in his eyes. "Then you understand why this knowledge is so important. The Apache and their wolf allies developed sustainable relationships with this land over thousands of years. They could teach us how to expand without destroying everything we depend on for survival." But even as understanding dawned, Whitmore's military discipline reasserted itself. "Samuel, I have my orders. Even if I personally agree with your arguments, I cannot simply ignore official policy." It was at this crucial moment that Masca made his ultimate sacrifice. The young wolf stepped forward until he stood directly between the two brothers, his silver eyes reflecting the collar light as he projected his consciousness directly into both human minds simultaneously. Through Masca's mental link, both men experienced the wolf's memories of the pack massacre, not as distant observers, but as if they had lived through the systematic destruction themselves. They felt the terror of the wolf pups as soldiers methodically eliminated their families, the desperate courage of adult wolves trying to protect their young, and the profound sadness of an ancient alliance dying in gunfire and blood. But more than memories of destruction, Maska shared visions of what could be restored. He showed them Apache villages, where children grew up learning to communicate with animal allies, where hunting was conducted in partnership with wolf packs that helped ensure the sustainability of game populations, where the natural cycles of the land were honored and protected rather than exploited and abandoned. The psychic sharing was so intense that both brothers staggered, their hands moving unconsciously to steady themselves against each other as the weight of wolf wisdom flooded through their human consciousness. When the visions ended, both men were changed in ways that would affect every decision they made for the rest of their lives. "My God!" Colonel Whitmore whispered, his military bearing cracking to reveal the horrified realization of what his orders would accomplish. "We're not protecting civilization. We're destroying the very knowledge that could save it." Dr. Hayes reached out to clasp his brother's shoulder, feeling the tremor of transformation that ran through the colonel's frame. "It's not too late, Marcus. You can choose to preserve this knowledge instead of destroying it." But even as the brothers reconciled, a new danger emerged from the darkness beyond the canyon. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of additional cavalry forces, reinforcements sent to ensure that Whitmore's mission was completed according to Washington's specifications. Regardless of any personal qualms the colonel might develop, "Fall back," Whitmore shouted to his own men, suddenly realizing that the greatest threat to the sacred canyon came not from Apache warriors, but from his own military hierarchy. Protect the civilians and the archaeological sites. The scene that followed defied all conventional understanding of military engagement. As the reinforcement cavalry charged into the canyon with orders to secure the artifacts and eliminate any resistance, they found themselves facing not opposing human forces, but a unified alliance of Apache warriors, reformed cavalry soldiers, and wolves working together with supernatural coordination. Tarek and his warriors moved with fluid grace alongside Whitmore's converted troops, their combined tactics guided by the wolf pack's superior intelligence and sensory awareness. The wolf speaker's influence, channeled through Maska and his expanding network, allowed human and lupine consciousness to merge in ways that created combat effectiveness far beyond what either species could achieve alone. But the true power of the alliance was revealed when the healing spring waters began to flow from deep within the canyon's inner sanctum. As the song stones awakened fully to the presence of restored harmony between human and wolf consciousness, they triggered the release of sacred waters that had been sealed away since the last wolf speaker walked the earth generations ago. The springs possessed properties that went far beyond mere healing of physical wounds. The waters carried the power to transform hearts and minds, washing away the accumulated hatred and fear that had driven the conflicts between Apache and cavalry. Soldiers who entered the canyon planning conquest found themselves overcome with understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. Apache warriors who had prepared to die defending their sacred sites discovered that their greatest victory would come through teaching rather than fighting. Even the most hardened reinforcement troops found their aggressive intentions dissolving. As the mystical waters touched their skin and the synchronized drumbeat of two worlds reached into their souls, violence became not just unnecessary, but impossible in the presence of such overwhelming evidence of unity and harmony. Colonel Whitmore, standing in the healing waters with his brother and their former enemies, realized that his choice was complete. He would not only refuse to carry out his destructive orders, but would dedicate the rest of his life to protecting and preserving the knowledge that Ahuli and Maska had risked everything to save. 1 year had passed since the night that changed the world, and Ahuli stood once again at the entrance to the sacred canyon, though now she came not as a frightened child seeking healing herbs, but as the acknowledged wolf speaker of her generation. The transformation in both herself and the land around her was remarkable beyond anything the ancient prophecies had dared to promise. The treaty stone, carved from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls and blessed by representatives of both. Apache bands and the reformed cavalry units marked the permanent boundary of the sacred wolf grounds. The massive boulder bore inscriptions in 3 languages: Apache pictographs, English text, and the flowing symbols that seemed to shift and dance like the mysterious writing on Maska's collar. It stood as a monument to the possibility of cooperation between peoples who had once seemed destined for eternal conflict. Ahuli had grown taller in the past year, her 13-year-old frame beginning to show the promise of the woman she would become. But more significant than her physical development was the quiet confidence that radiated from her as she moved through the world she had helped to reshape. The frightened girl who had once hidden a dying wolf pup in her family's wickiup had evolved into a bridge between worlds, equally comfortable communicating with Apache elders and cavalry officers. With congressional investigators from Washington and wolf packs scattered across the vast wilderness, Maska paced beside her, no longer the tiny creature she could hold in cupped hands, but a magnificent wolf whose silver eyes held the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. His collar had changed too, its mysterious metal now incorporating elements from both ancient artifacts, creating a synthesis that pulsed with harmonies audible to anyone who had learned to listen with more than mere ears. "The new students arrived today," Ahuli observed, watching dust clouds on the horizon that marked the approach of wagons, carrying the latest group of young people sent to study at the unprecedented school that had emerged from the sacred canyons. Transformation. The Apache Cavalry Academy, as it was formerly known, represented something entirely new in the relationship between indigenous peoples and the expanding United States government. Children from both cultures came to learn not just traditional academic subjects, but the deeper knowledge of sustainable relationships with the natural world that had been preserved in Apache traditions and wolf consciousness. Dr. Samuel Hayes, now serving as the Academy's chief medical officer and cultural liaison, had resigned his military commission to dedicate his life to the revolutionary educational experiment. His brother Marcus, promoted rather than court-martialed due to the unexpected success of his mission in the Sacred Canyon, commanded a new type of cavalry unit tasked with protecting indigenous cultural sites rather than destroying them. 23 students this session, Dr. Hayes announced as he joined Ahuli and Maska at the Treaty Stone, including the first delegation from the Lakota nations and 3 children whose parents work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Ahuli smiled at the irony. The same government agencies that had once sought to eliminate indigenous cultures were now sending their own children to learn from the wisdom those cultures had preserved. The healing waters of the sacred springs had indeed transformed hearts and minds, but the real change had come through practical demonstration that cooperation produced better results than conquest. The wolf population in the territory had not only recovered but thrived under the protection of the joint Apache cavalry patrols. Game animals had returned to regions where they had been nearly extinct, and the sustainable hunting practices taught by wolf pack behavior had proven more effective than the aggressive exploitation methods favored by most settlers. Chief Cochise sends word that the autumn gathering will be the largest in living memory, Dr. Hayes continued, referring to the annual ceremony where Apache bands from across the Southwest came to renew their connections to the Wolf Alliance. Tribes that haven't participated in the old rituals for generations are sending representatives. As they spoke, a familiar figure approached from the direction of the Apache camp. Grandmother Itzel moved more slowly than she had a year ago, but her eyes remained as sharp as ever, and the medicine pouch at her side had been supplemented by a new collection of artifacts recovered from the sacred springs. "Little Wolf Speaker," the elder greeted Ahuli with the formal title that had replaced her childhood name in many ceremonies, though family members still called her by the name her parents had given her. "The spirits whisper that today brings not just new students, but a test of how far the healing has truly reached. Ahuli felt Maska's presence in her mind shift toward alertness, his supernatural senses detecting something that had escaped normal human perception. Through their mental connection, she perceived the approach of riders whose emotional emanations carried traces of hostility and skepticism rather than the curiosity and hope that characterized most visitors to the sacred canyon. Congressional investigators, Dr. Hayes identified, reading the formal documents carried by the lead rider. Senator Bradley's Committee on Territorial Development. They're here to evaluate whether the sacred wolf grounds should retain their protected status. The evening council proved to be one of the most significant gatherings since the original treaty signing. Representatives from 7 different Apache bands had arrived, along with delegates from Lakota, Cherokee, and Navajo nations who had traveled hundreds of miles to learn about the Wolf Alliance. Most remarkably, 3 European naturalists and 2 professors from Eastern universities sat among the traditional circle, their notebooks and scientific instruments accepted alongside eagle feathers and sacred pipes. Chief Cochise, now recognized as the principal leader of the alliance, spoke first about the expansion of the Joint Patrol System. The Sacred Sites Protection Program has grown beyond our original territory, he announced. 17 different locations across the Western Territories are now under joint indigenous military protection, and each month brings new requests for assistance in establishing similar programs. Colonel Whitmore, whose transformation from destroyer to protector had become legendary throughout the military establishment, presented the strategic perspective that had convinced many of his superiors to support the new approach. Gentlemen and honored elders, he said, the practical benefits of cooperation cannot be disputed. Territories under joint protection have seen dramatic improvements in agricultural productivity, wildlife populations, and settler safety. More importantly, conflicts between indigenous peoples and newcomers have decreased by 70% in areas where the alliance model has been implemented. But it was Grandmother Itzel who provided the evening's most profound wisdom. Rising slowly from her place in the circle, the ancient medicine woman spoke in the voice that had guided Apache spiritual life for nearly 8 decades. The young wolf speaker has shown us that the smallest acts of compassion can indeed change the world, she said, her weathered face illuminated by firelight as she looked directly at Ahuli. But tonight, I share visions that speak of even greater challenges ahead. The alliance we have built here will be tested by forces we have not yet encountered. Those who would use our success to justify even greater exploitation of other lands, other peoples. The gathering listened in respectful silence as Itzel described dreams that had been visiting her with increasing frequency. Visions of the alliance model being corrupted into a tool for conquest rather than cooperation, of indigenous wisdom being appropriated without respect for its sources, of the very success of the sacred wolf grounds being used to justify aggressive expansion into territories where similar alliances did not yet exist. The path forward requires constant vigilance, the elder warned. Each new student who learns our ways, each new territory that adopts our methods, must understand that this knowledge comes with responsibilities that cannot be separated from its power. Ahuli felt the weight of these words settling into her consciousness, like stones dropping into deep water. Through her connection with Maska, she could sense similar concerns among the wolf packs. Awareness that their renewed alliance with humans brought both opportunity and danger, protection and exposure. As the formal council concluded and the participants began to disperse toward their sleeping areas, Ahuli found herself alone with Maska at the spot where she had first discovered him, barely clinging to life. The contrast between that desperate moment and the thriving alliance they had built together filled her with a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal accomplishment. "We've done well, haven't we, old friend?" she said, stroking the magnificent wolf silver fur as stars emerged in the desert sky above them. We have begun. Maska's mental voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom and hard-won experience. The healing spreads, but slowly. There will be other challenges, other tests of whether humans can truly learn to live in harmony with the natural world. Through the growing darkness, a small sound caught Ahuli's attention, the faint whimper of a creature in distress, coming from deeper in the canyon where she had first heard Maska's desperate calls for help. Her heart racing with déjà vu, she followed the sound to its source, with Maska padding silently beside her. In a small alcove protected by an overhanging ledge of rock, she found another tiny wolf pup, even smaller than Maska had been, struggling to survive in the harsh desert environment. But this pup wore no mysterious collar, carried no ancient power. It was simply a lost baby whose family had perished in some natural disaster or human encroachment. As Ahuli gently scooped the pup into her arms, she realized that the cycle was beginning again. The smallest acts of compassion could indeed change the world, but they had to be repeated endlessly, one creature at a time, one moment of kindness building upon another, until the accumulated weight of caring transformed everything it touched. "New student," Maska observed with gentle humor in his mental voice as he sniffed the tiny newcomer with friendly interest. "Perhaps this one will learn different lessons than I did, but the same love that saved me will guide his path as well." The wolf speaker's work was never finished. It simply evolved, deepened, and passed from one generation to the next, carried forward by those who understood that healing the wounds between worlds required not grand gestures, but daily commitment to seeing the sacred in every living thing. As she carried the new pup toward the healing springs, Ahuli smiled at the knowledge that somewhere, years in the future, another young person would face the choice between fear and compassion, between the safety of tradition and the risk of transformation. And when that moment came, they would find guides and allies waiting to help them discover their own role in the endless work of healing a world that desperately needed their unique gifts. The smallest wolf pup ever seen had grown into a bridge between worlds, but the real magic lay not in his supernatural nature, but in the love that had saved him, nurtured him, and taught him to trust in the possibility of healing what seemed hopelessly broken. And now that love would continue its work through another small creature, whose own journey toward healing was just beginning. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to countless acts of kindness that had shaped the world since the beginning of time. In the sacred canyon where ancient and modern wisdom had learned to work together, the future remained unwritten but full of hope, carried forward by young hearts brave enough to believe that the smallest gestures of compassion could indeed change everything.